Hello everyone, we are continuing with the governing the commons by Ostrom. So, in the last class we talked about what are the context of the self governance, that are the principles are proposed by the author Ostrom. So, today we will be deciding and describing what are those design principles that she propounded, and by following those designing principles the CPR management can be successful. So, let us discuss those 8 design principles for self governance of the CPR institutions, which can lead to successful CPR management itself. So, what are these 8 principles which must be taken into account so far the self governance mechanism or institutions are to be created for governing the CPR itself. So, the first one is that the CPR institutions has clearly defined boundaries. We need to delineate that what is the boundary of these CPR institutions. That means, when you are saying this clearly defining the boundaries of these CPR institutions, we are actually taking to the question who are the individuals or groups who can have the right to withdraw the resources or use the resources from a common pool systems. It must be clearly defined, and we need to clearly define the boundaries of the CPR itself. These are the physical boundary of the CPR, beyond which we cannot actually do not have any users right. So, this is the first criteria that for maintaining or for instituting the self governing institutions for CPR, it must be followed. Then the second criteria or the second principle that must be followed is congruence between the appropriation and provision rules and local conditions itself. That means, the participants they must understand, or the stakeholders, or here you are saying the user groups or the local community who are appropriating these resources, they must understand the right time for resource extractions, when they can actually extract the resources from this CPR, and when we need to deny, completely restrict, that we cannot in this time we cannot actually extract any resources. So, the time factors must be taken into account for the harvest or to forbid the harvest. And the second important variable is the place. Obviously, the kind of structure, the geographical conditions are concerned, the place is obviously different. So, when time is also important, place is also important in harvesting the resources from the common pool resources. It may differ from place to place, we need to take into account that, and the participant they must actually understand from their very tradition that this place is something different than the other places. Then we need to choose what is the right time and what is the right place. And another variable that must be taken into account in order to find a congruence between these rules, these groups and the local conditions is the technology. What kind of technology is available for monitoring the system or extracting the resources, and it all depends on the local conditions and the provisioning rules. And again, we need to also talk about the provisioning rules in terms of the labor, in terms of material, or in terms of monetary exchange. So, these are necessary for provisioning rules, that how to provide these resources, in which form. So, it is a kind of finding the exchange, the unit of exchange, maybe in terms of labor, maybe in terms of material, or maybe in terms of monetary units. The third principles that she talked about is collective choice arrangements. So, that means she wanted to highlight the operational rules that can participate in modifying the operational rules. So, what is this? That means, obviously the users they are independent in finding the right kind of operational rules, and they do have the freedom in modifying the same. If they are finding that the existing operational rule is not actually giving us, is not leading us in a systematic manner or for a sustainable manner, then it can be modified. So, that is the collective choice for arrangements. So, another criteria or principle is monitoring. Who is monitoring? Who actively audit these CPR conditions. Those participants must audit the CPR itself, the resources and the appropriator behavior. So, the CPR conditions and the user's behavior, it must be taken into account and they must be accountable to the appropriators, so that a kind of monitoring system can happen, can occur automatically. So, the monitors must actively audit the CPR conditions, this is the first thing. And the second responsibility is that their right behavior, the kind of behavior they are displaying for monitoring the CPRs. And perhaps this is one of the utmost priority that must be taken into account for building the right institutions for self-governance. So, another principle she talked about is graduated sanctions. So, what is this? That means, if the members or users, they are not behaving appropriately or as per the contracts, then obviously they must be penalized, or there should be some kind of sanctions. Who violate the operational rules that is framed by themselves itself, so that it will be leading a kind of transparency system and the system of governance will be automatically carried forward. So, another rule for this successful of self-governance is conflict resolution mechanisms. Obviously, in this decision making process, so far this collective action is concerned, we will be finding so many conflicts. Then what are these conflict resolution mechanisms? So, obviously, these are the stakeholders, or these are the mechanisms, right, appropriators by themselves and the officials who are in responsibility for monitoring the systems. If there is any kind of conflict among the appropriators or between the appropriators and the officials itself who carry forward or who monitor or audit the resource itself, then it can be resolved by frequently contacting with each other, that is rapid access to low cost local arenas to resolve conflicts among the appropriators or between appropriators and the officials. Why we are saying this mechanism is good and it is low cost? Because obviously when you are saying that they are in close proximity, so this is the first conditions, right, and when the appropriators and the officials who are in charge of monitoring and auditing, they are in close proximity, that means the communication will be frequent. There will be no involvement of high transaction cost, or this is the one of the lowest kind of costs we will be finding in arranging some kind of meeting, because all the stakeholders, the appropriators as well as the officials, they are in close proximity. So, this is a right kind of conflict resolutions mechanisms she talked about. So, another guideline or principle she talked about is minimal recognition of rights to organize. So, that means the rights of the appropriators or users to devise their own institutions are not challenged by some external factors or some higher authorities, like maybe the state. So, here she clearly said that in this CPR management, government authorities should not be a party. There should not be any external interference in terms of this government authorities and their power. And the last point she talked about, she imagines this CPR to be the part of a larger system, if it is so, because when you are saying this CPR and commons, generally we are thinking about a micro scale, maybe a locality, maybe a villagers management, maybe a community management. But when these CPRs are a part of a larger system, then there will be involved a multifaceted interest or many interest group will be involved. There may be involvement of overlapping boundaries. So, in this case we need to talk about the rules of or the recognition of nested enterprise. We need to find out or identify who are in this loop, who are those interest group for this common property resources. So, once you understand and identify this, then we can talk about what would be the appropriations, who can appropriate the resources, what kind of provisions rule would be there, what kind of monitoring systems or contract would be there, what would be the enforcement rule and contract, what kind of strategies so far the conflict resolutions can be adapted, and the kind of governance activities. So, the last point actually talks about beyond the micro scale, maybe to a macro level, and it may be imagined as a larger system than this CPR, the traditional CPR. So, after understanding all these principles, 8 principles that she talked about for sustainable self-governance of the CPR itself, now we need to know that what is the applications or where we can find this collective action problems. So, we can find the collective action problems so far the pollution is concerned, that is in terms of greenhouses perhaps. So, we can talk about the Kyoto Protocol and the kind of stakeholders, the countries those who are involved about, and we can also talk about the terrorism related collective actions, that who are the countries who are participating for anti-terrorism act, or who are the countries who actually really want to address the terrorism related problems. It can also be applicable to the health based collective actions. So far the intergenerational component is concerned, again it may be related to air pollutions, or we can also talk about conservation and preservation of the biodiversity of the planet, or the public sanitations, blood donation camps, and the kind of networks, elections. So, these are so many examples of real life examples we do have. So far these collective actions problems and the features of very collective actions are concerned. After understanding what is the theory, what can be the examples, or what can be the situations where we can find this commons or common problem, now we can actually think about the pros and cons of Ostrom's argument. Let us talk about the pros first. What is the advantages, or what is the benefits, or what is the new thing she talked about in her argument. For the first time she challenged to the first generational theory of commons that I have already explained, that how she challenged the conventional or existing theories that were propounded in 60s, 70s. And all these major theories like tragedy of the commons, group behavior and collective action and prisoner's dilemma. She challenged all these theories. These are known as the first generation theory of the commons. So, this is the positive or the benefit side or advantages of our argument. And second contributions can be in terms of institutional analysis. She talked about the self-governance and the kind of the rules that needs to be made for making these institutions sustainable. So, this is again the part of the institutional schools of thought or highlighting, or she contributed for the development of or evolution of the institutional analysis itself. And also she contributed to the second generation theories on the commons by suggesting the possibility of self-governance as viable solution to collective action problem. So, this is the importance of self-governance. So, in this second generation theories, it points out these theories, they point out the centrality of trust and reciprocity as the main determinants of collective actions. In the, if you are finding the literature on the commons and in this second generational theories, then we will be finding that the success of these commons will be dependent on the trust among the members or participants and the reciprocity, the kind of the frequency of which they are communicating for actions against actions or actions for actions. So, these are the main determinants of the collective actions, and these 2 points, centrality of trust and reciprocity, holds the very crust of the very backbone of the second generation theories on the commons itself, and she contributed in this regard how to build trust and how to reciprocate. However, so far the critics of this theory is concerned governing the commons. So, it can be again said, she criticized Hardin's tragedy of commons, but however, her critics say that this Hardin's tragedy of commons may be valid for special cases like small scale. So, when she criticized the Hardin's theory of commons, her critics said that it may be valid for the special cases like micro scales or the small scale cases or the locally governed commons, but the original Hardin's theory, it seems justified for the macro scales like a particular region, global commons or national commons. So, there it is very difficult to actually go for organizing or finding a self-governance mechanism in terms of institutions. So, this is one of the critics against this governance of the commons. It may be her criticism may be applicable so far the tragedy of the commons thought is concerned, may be applicable for special cases for the micro scales, but for macro scales still the tragedy of the commons phenomenon may be prevalent. So, another criticism is validity of her institutional design principles. So, right now as you understand that she propounded, she actually thought about, she worked on institutional design principles and she talked about 8 different institutional design principles in order to maintain these self-governance mechanisms sustainable. And however, this validity of the institutional design principles can be applicable for long-lived commons, but managing global commons requires a different set of government principles compared with the local commons. So, this is again one of the criticism, another criticism, that maybe this institutional design can tackle the problem of the micro or the local commons, but for governance of the global commons, the principles will be different. Because if you can take into account, so let us take the case of the biodiversity and the conservation. So, the biodiversity and conservation, this policy or these objectives or these common actions at the global scale may be impacted by so many institutions and so many acts or so many strategies you can say. So, let us say it can be impacted by the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity Act, or it can be also impacted by some negotiations by the UN. So, in this way the governance principles that she talked about can be meant for the local commons, but for managing the global commons it will be requiring some different set of governance principles. That is how her critics were saying. And moreover, that is why we cannot actually generalize this 8 institutional design principle for macro as well as micro scales. So, this is again the problem of generalization of these 8 design principles. So, for the local commons and the global commons are concerned. And another criticism may be in terms of her failure to distinguish between the commons and partnership arrangement. There is a difference. Perhaps it seems that her theory is treating both of these arrangements equally. So, if you see the case of commons, so in this case the outsider can be excluded because it is a commons. The very feature is you can exclude from the very entry because of these mechanisms. But in case of the partners or partnership arrangement, the same principle of excluding from the entry, outsider exclusion from the entry may not be possible. So, the criticisms can be led that this theory is having its failure, or it cannot actually deal successfully so far the differentiation between the commons and partnership arrangement is concerned. So, these are the two basic references that you must look into. So, this is the book that we are talking about, Governing the Commons, the Evolution of Institutions for the Collective Actions, and you can also follow this one of the recent articles, which by following you can actually find out what can be the criticism or how the Ostrom's thinking or argument may not be applicable in some conditional cases.